One of the biggest sticking points that I see online around the Switch 2 for people are those game key cards. And there was a lot of mystery around those cards for a bit until we had a leak that came out from Arc System Works that shows there really aren't many options when it comes to some of these third-party companies, them just trying to make money off their Switch 2 releases, as we have a 64 gigabyte cartridge and then just the small game key card. Well, we did get a response from Nintendo around their view of physical media going into this new generation, and I do have to ask the question if offering the Game Key and now seeing it appear so much is something that will end up backfiring on Nintendo's plans, and actually if it's something that they may end up wanting in the long run, but we'll go over that here today. So if you guys enjoy this video, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you're new. So I do want to point out that not everyone out there necessarily hates game key cards. Some look at it as a way for Nintendo to at least try to navigate this situation of, look, these cartridges just in general are expensive. Games are getting larger. Let's come up with a way to sort of meet third parties somewhere in the middle while still retaining technical ownership of a cartridge that you can trade in, sell, or I guess trade back and forth with friends. While yes, you do have to download the entirety of the game and store it on your Switch 2 internal storage or a micro SD Express card, which I think is the biggest drawback actually, is the fact that you do still need maybe 50 or 60 gigabytes free on your Switch 2 to play these games despite having the cartridge. It's still something that necessarily won't affect or annoy everyone, and if you're all digital, you probably don't really care about game key cards in general, although there is something that I think even if you're all digital, you should be paying attention to here. But first, let's take a look. This is posted up over on the Outer Haven. They're quoting IGN as they were talking with Nintendo of America President Doug Bowser about game key cards, because again, it's a hot button topic right now online, especially for collectors out there who come off of the Switch generation where, yes, there were games that had the blue banner, and you knew at that point either it was a code in the box or it was a situation where you had the cartridge, but you have to download a large chunk maybe of the game. So this isn't new, but this is something that's much more widespread now already. This is what he had to say about the whole game keycard thing. In the immediate future, physical games are still a key part of our business, and we value our relationships, in particular with our retailers, and want to make sure we have products available for them to sell to their consumers. When you look at game key cards, for us, our goal with Nintendo Switch 2, similar to what we were able to accomplish on Nintendo Switch, is to have the broadest and deepest library of content we possibly can. And that includes our publishing partners, and game key cards are a way that our publishing partners are able to bring more content onto the platform. Deeper and larger, more immersive content on the platform. So to start, Doug Bowser is mentioning that the library of games is larger essentially because of these game key cards, enabling publishers to bring over games that just wouldn't make sense for them to bring over if there wasn't a way to store it on a cartridge that makes sense. And you kind of see the way that they're going here with 64 gigabyte cartridges being a last resort almost, it feels like, and game key cards being the more popular thing with third parties. Well, if game key cards weren't here, and who's to say if they'd even use 32 gig cards, because we didn't see those used much at all with the current Switch generation for those 8 years, most likely they just would not have brought the game over. So on one hand, yes, the game key card is enabling some of these third-party ports to exist at all. He also confirmed at this time that Nintendo is, for their own first-party releases physically, they will be using just the 64 gigabyte cartridge. So you won't have an issue where you buy a Nintendo first-party game and you have to do the game key card route where you have to download the entirety of it, which is interesting because even their own games are getting larger and larger. Mario Kart is 24 some odd gigabytes. So I'm kind of thinking about the next big 3D Zelda game that, if you look at Tears of the Kingdom on the Switch, that was a pretty large file size. Thinking we could see maybe an even larger game from Nintendo when we eventually do get the next big Switch 2 release in the Zelda franchise. Who knows when it comes to a new big 3D Mario game, although Mario Odyssey was surprisingly small in terms of its file size, so maybe they have that figured out there. But still, Nintendo does say that physical games are an important part of their business, primarily, as they mentioned here, because of the relationship with retailers. And that is an important space for them, because if you look in Japan, when we see the sales charts, they are typically like out of 10, they control 8 to 9 spots usually. If there's no big third-party PlayStation release that's out, generally they control 10 of 10, okay? And those are all physical releases and sales. So game key cards fit in there for retailers to still have something to sell. This is, I think, a concern as we go more and more digital with a lot of these games and the sales, is why would retailers necessarily carry your accessories, your systems, carve out an entire section in electronics or even elsewhere in their big box store to just sell the system that doesn't make them any money? The idea is to sell software and other things that are higher margin than the console. So it does make sense to at least keep good relations with any of these different retailers so you can still sell and have something that's more front-facing in big box stores at retail for a lot of the mainstream consumers. Otherwise, when it's all digital, I mean, it really would be like all digital to where even buying your system will be done most likely online. We'll see how GameStop holds up here with some of these game key cards, because my thought here as we're going through this generation with the Switch 2, if you look at their current situation when it comes to digital with sales, I mean, proportion of digital sales you can see bounces around anywhere from 60% down to 43%, up to almost 63%. It is kind of fluctuating all over the place, and while Nintendo does separate out full game purchases, which they show there recently with this last fiscal quarter, that would have been the first 3 months of 2025, almost 36%. So they are still pretty reliant, I would say, because again, that's removing DLC or NSO stuff. That's pretty reliant still on physical media selling. And when I look at the game key cards, I do wonder so we kind of know what it is, but there will be situations, I'm sure, where people just out there in general buy it as a gift for themselves or without looking too deeply into how all of it necessarily works and what a game key card is. They'll find out when they pop it into their system. And depending on the situation, they will either be surprised and somewhat annoyed or shocked because, oh, wow, I bought this on the way out, maybe for a trip, and now I can't really play this until I find reliable internet that will allow me to download. I mean, who knows, maybe buy Street Fighter and it's 50 to 60 gigabytes or something. That is a one-time download, of course. So unless you delete it, then you have to come back to it later on. Maybe you got to free up space. But that's something I thought about here. The idea of the cartridge physically was there was a convenience in you pop the cartridge in and 9 times out of 10 it'll start up. Sure, it might ask you for a patch, but you could still start the game without the patch. Here though, you need the patch because the patch is the game. Okay, so if that's the case, how many people go, maybe I'll just buy it digitally next time? What am I doing with this here? Because I'm already downloading the game onto my system anyway. And while, again, the idea of trading in or selling is a good thing just have in mind, that's necessarily not going to be a deciding factor for everyone, as some just hold on to their games in general as they like to collect and say build up the stack of games on their bookshelf or something. So this is a number that is going to be very, very interesting to keep an eye on as we go through even the first year of the Switch 2, because as we know now, I mean, nearly half of all Switch 2 games that have been shown are game key cards. And if you have either a 64 gigabyte cartridge or a game key, it's hard to imagine why a lot of these big publishers go, well, yeah, we want to spend more money on the distribution of this game, especially if it's a late port or something, because maybe they want to charge $50 for the game. Well, the 64 gigabyte cartridge it's hard to say how much it is. Some have speculated on a number of like $14 to $16 for the cart itself. None of that makes sense then. 30% to Nintendo. You still have some more logistics behind the scenes for packaging and setting up the box art and other parts there. And then $16 on top of that maybe for the cartridge. None of that really adds up from a business perspective. Perfect world, it'd be great to have all this stuff on just a cartridge in general. Now, the reasoning here that's been thrown around from Nintendo is that if everyone's buying these 64 gigabyte cartridges, the price will come down over time because they're just large bulk orders going in. And if Nintendo dedicates all of their first party games to using 64 gigabyte cartridges, they themselves might order enough to make it cheaper for third party. But my question then comes in as, will it ever be cheaper than a game key card? Because if that becomes more and more normalized, why wouldn't you just use a game key card if the entire consumer base, for the most part, already knows what it is expecting it, and then in turn, maybe they just go over to digital anyway, which works out in the publisher's favor, and in some cases would also work in Nintendo's favor. I know I just mentioned they're very reliant on physical games, but Nintendo just flat out makes more money on digital. Like, it's just how it is, because they don't have to worry about the cartridge. They don't have to worry about shipping things out. They don't have to worry about street dates being broken. They even have more control that way, and we know how Nintendo is. They do like their control. So when I look at this, I do see this as, to me, it looks like something that would backfire on Nintendo's current position when it comes to physical media. But is that really backfiring if at the end of the day they make more money and it actually works out for them in the long run if everyone goes digital and they just their profits end up going up from it? So it's an odd situation. I understand why, like, these big businesses are not necessarily opposed to game key cards, but I also understand why a lot of people out there who are collecting for their systems or just want even, say, full ownership over them aren't necessarily thrilled about the big trend, the big push for these game key cards all over the place. At the same time, I also understand why some people are like, yeah, I'm digital anyway because it's just convenient. Not having to carry around a lot of cartridges for your Switch or Switch 2 when you're traveling. Yeah, that is a massive benefit in that case. So I'm curious if this generation we just see a larger and larger trend towards just all digital for people. Again, Nintendo lays it out. And if we eventually, maybe 3 or 4 years in, we get a system from Nintendo that has no cartridge slot and it's just a digital system, because that would then in turn give them the ability to subsidize it further by saying, well, you're only going to buy from the eShop anyway, so we'll make even more money from you, even if we have to take a slight loss on it up front. But let me know what you guys think about all of this down below with the game key cards, Nintendo's response, and if they're all for physical, if this is something that could backfire, or if it's more all according to plan here throughout the generation. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.